Our forum today is on sustainable food and farming and how we're going to feed the world better without factory farms. And a little bit of background, for more than a decade, I've been working with communities across Indiana to stop the proliferation of factory farms. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say that, factory farms are just inevitable and necessary to feed the world's growing population that's expected to reach 10 billion by 2050. Well, today we're going to dispel that myth, and it is a myth. It's one perpetuated by multinational corporations that now dominate global food production to protect their bottom lines. The truth is that the only way we're going to be able to feed the world sustainably and without destroying the planet and ourselves in the process is to do away with factory farms. In fact, the world already produces enough food to feed 10 billion people. But the real problem is that much of that food goes to feed factory farmed livestock instead of people. There's a staggering amount of land, water, and energy resources that go into growing the vast monocrops of corn and soy that go to feed factory farmed animals, not to grow crops for direct human consumption. As a result of this hugely inefficient system that we have now, of feeding billions of farm animals to feed the world, not only doesn't feed the world very well at all, it's a leading cause of the most serious environmental problems we face at every scale, from local to global, including global climate change. So that's what we're going to talk about today. First, I'm going to cover how we got an industrialized food system controlled by a handful of large corporations. After all, our food system wasn't always this way, and understanding how to fix it requires understanding what broke it in the first place. We're also going to talk about why the current system is a problem for all of us, not just rural farming communities. In fact, people who live in cities and urban areas also suffer the ill effects of our broken food system. And making this connection for people on issues that they care about, where they're at, is how we grow the movement for change. So we're going to do that. I'm also going to discuss how existing laws and policies have failed to address the problem. And then finally, what we can do about it, both in terms of policy advocacy and as consumers. On the solutions front, I am truly honored to be joined by a true national rock star and leader on this issue, Dr. John Eichard. Dr. Ikerd grew up on a small dairy farm in Missouri and later earned his PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri, where he is now a professor emeritus. Dr. Ikerd's long list of accomplishments and immense contribution to the national and indeed global call for transitioning to a sustainable and equitable food system, including, I might add, writing 6 books on the subject, would take me all morning to share with you. So if you're not familiar with Dr. Eichard's work, I encourage you to go to johnichard.com and get acquainted with him and get inspired by his work, as I have been. Dr. Ikerd and I, after my presentation, will have a conversation about how our advocacy for a sustainable food system and against factory farms in particular fits into a larger social movement for a sustainable and just society. And the success of both of these movements ultimately depends on us rethinking our economic, social, and ethical priorities. And as you'll hear from him, that's got to start with us as activists and the organizations that we belong to. He'll also share some ideas with us about how we might do that. And hopefully he'll correct anything that I state incorrectly or emphasize some things that maybe I missed, because this is truly an immense topic and we can't possibly cover all of it in just 2 hours. So welcome, Dr. Ikerd. I look forward to talking with you at the end. As Jenny mentioned earlier, please post questions in the chat box for us to address during our question and answer period. I would normally allow questions as I talk, but there's just too many people and we've got too much to cover. So Jenny will make sure to compile those questions and we will do our best to answer them at the end. Also, no need to take notes. Everything I'm going to cover today is discussed in detail in the citizen guide that we prepared on this topic, which is available online. And I think you should have received an email from us this morning with a link to that citizen guide. All right, so let's start with how we got here. You might think that corporate consolidation and industrialization of our food system is just the inevitable result of the Industrial Revolution, where technologies improved and farm families just decided to leave the country, realizing they could make a better living in the city. This is true to some extent, but really much of what happened is the result of carefully developed and successfully implemented policies to purposefully eliminate family farms. How do we know that? Well, in the mid-1950s, leaders of major U.S. corporations, including Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Sears Roebuck, Standard Oil, Johnson & Johnson, American Electric, Hormel, Heinz, Eastman Kodak, and others that are listed here, came together as part of the Committee on Economic Development, or the CED. The CED is a business policy think tank that was formed after the Great Depression. And these industry leaders prepared or proposed a, quote, adaptive program for agriculture. Now, this CED policy proposal that I'm going to discuss is referenced in numerous scholarly articles, books, and other writings as pivotal to the changes in farm policy that gave rise to our current food system. The copy that I was able to locate actually has someone's notes on it that you'll see as we go through some of these slides. The highlights, though, are mine. So the purpose of the CED's adaptive program was to address what these corporate leaders then saw as the American farm problem. In their view, this farm problem was undermining economic growth and their financial interests. Namely, the problem, according to them, was too many farmers and not enough factory workers and laborers in other sectors, what they characterized as the inadequate, quote, inadequate flow of resources out of farming. To fix this farm problem, these industry leaders proposed to reduce the farm labor force by 1/3 over a 5-year period, which would involve, quote, moving off the farm about 2 million of the farm labor force, then at 5.5 million, plus a number equal to a large part of the new entrants who would otherwise join the farm labor force in 5 years. To achieve this displacement of 2 million farmers, they proposed that the government immediately lower the price supports for farmers that had been in place since the Great Depression to below parity, so that small farmers wouldn't be able to make a living and would get out of farming. According to these industry leaders, displacing 2 million farmers through below parity pricing would provide cheaper raw materials for food and fiber processors, i.e., the people who make the meat, process the food, cheaper labor costs for non-agricultural industries, because adding 2 million people to the urban labor pool would tend to depress wages overall. And then, of course, an increased return on corporate investment in agriculture. So in other words, the plan was aimed not at benefiting the public interest, but at benefiting these industries' bottom line. In my view, something particularly insidious that I came upon was the fact that these industry leaders recognized that policy change would not be enough to push generational farmers out of farming fast enough. It would also require cultural change. And on that front, they proposed, quote, investing in projects that break up village life, because village life is a major source of opposition to change. They also suggested that where there are religious obstacles to modern economic progress, the religion may have to be taken less. Can you guys hear me now? Seems like I must have been.
Yeah, you're back on now, Kim.
How long was I off? I'm sorry.
Sorry, Kim. Yeah, that just
a couple
happened.
of sentences, that's all.
It just happened. Okay.
Yeah, you're fine.
All right. Well, let's keep going then. Oh. I think Having trouble here.
We can hear you.
Yeah, my slides are not advancing.
Okay.
You might try just stopping your recorder or stopping your sharing screen and then restarting it. That often fixes.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah.
Sure. Not sure what just happened.
Okay, well, let's see if that works. Nope. All right.
Still not advancing?
No, I'm going to try something else. Let's see.
Bear with us, everybody. I'm sure you see this happen.
There we go. Do y'all see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yay, there we go. Okay. So during the congressional committee hearings on the CED's proposal to displace farmers, farming groups from across the country sounded the alarm. Here's an example of a letter written by the Wisconsin Farmers Union to the House Ag Committee at the time. He writes, or they write, the president of the Wisconsin Farmers Union writes, many farmers in Iowa have expressed deep concern over the statements released by the Committee for Economic Development. The thought of reducing farm units by 2 million and the elimination of farm legislation to control supply and support prices spells doom to the family farm type of agriculture as we know it here in Iowa. It's particularly discouraging to the younger generation that is now preparing to take their place in the production of food and fiber for the future. The program outlined by the CED would have a devastating effect on the business done in the more than 900 cities and towns in Iowa. It's been reported that one hometown businessman will go out of business for each 14 farmers that leave the trade area. This would lower the property values on Main Street and the homes of many of our senior citizens who are now retired. These unemployed farmers in rural towns would join the ranks of the already idle labor force, and the deliberate attempt to deprive people of the opportunity to own their own farm or business would undermine the foundations of democracy. Your efforts to counteract the recommendation of the CED development would be much appreciated. Oh, come on, what is going on here? There we go. The Iowa Farmers Union wrote a similar letter. I'm just going to start sort of halfway down. Their concerns, as you'll see, are exactly what we're dealing with now today. So the Iowa Farmers Union writes, the CED recommendations would aggravate rather than solve our farm problem. A free market for agriculture would bring a great price stability, family farm failures, and the gradual replacement of our traditional family type farming by concentrators of economic power. The impact on our rural and small town institutions would be tragic and immeasurable. The CED views of the farm problem as one of massive adjustment. A shifting of resources out of agriculture is the basic flaw in the whole misguided program. I'm going to go down further. Significantly, the CED says nothing about the real heart of the farm problem, which is the lack of farm bargaining power in the face of highly organized industry and labor. The administration's farm program was designed to give farmers some effective control over the prices of their products or bargaining power, but the CED plan would take what little bargaining power farmers have away from them. We hope to see the CED plan exposed in your hearings as the dangerous and heartless scheme it really is. Despite these warnings, the federal farm policy soon followed the CED's proposal with instructions to farmers to get big or get out, which they did in droves. Since the 1950s, the United States has lost more than 3 million farms. In addition, government supports shifted from ensuring that farmers received a fair price for their products to ensuring cheap commodity prices for agribusiness. Today, nearly 90% of all agricultural subsidies go to the largest farms, and all of this has served the intended purpose of expanding corporate consolidation and control of production. Today, just a handful of large corporations control food production, especially in the meat industry. Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef Packing Company control 83% of beef production in the U.S. Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and Smithfield control 66% of pork production. Tyson, JBS, Purdue, and Pilgrim's control more than half of poultry production. And under our antitrust laws, market consolidation above 45% is considered highly concentrated and likely abusive. When we say control, what we're talking about is vertical integration, where these corporations control all stages of meat production, from genetics, birthing, feeding, transport, slaughter, processing, marketing to grocery store packaging. And as the farming groups warned back in the 1950s, this has not only squeezed out the small farmer who can't compete, but has decimated rural farming communities by eliminating the local infrastructure and businesses that once served the local farmers. So today, instead of family farmers raising livestock for local consumers, there are now roughly 25,000 industrial-scale livestock operations in the country, also known as CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, that produce the vast majority, 7.1 billion of the 9.8 billion farm animals that are raised and slaughtered each year in the United States. According to the most recent USDA agricultural census, approximately 70% of cows, 98% of pigs, 99% of turkeys, 98% of chickens raised for eggs, and 99% of chickens raised for meat are raised in factory farms, just like the one you see here. Same is true in Indiana. We have around 1,800 factory farms where the vast majority of food animals are produced. We rank second nationally for egg production with 26.4 million laying hens, 90% of which, 24 million of those hens, are confined in just 25 factory farms. We also lead the country in hog production, ranking sixth nationally with 11.3 million hogs sold annually. 91% of those came from just 516 hog factories. So aside from the inequity of displacing millions of farm families and decimating farming communities, why should any one of us care who live, those of us who live in urban areas care about the fact that most of our meat, dairy products come from factory farms? Well, first of all, CAFOs have made our water unsafe to drink, swim, and fish in. We know this based on government data. That the leading source of water contamination in Indiana continues to be E. coli, which indicates that animal waste is present. Now, this E. coli contamination is in part due to releases of human waste from our failing infrastructure, sanitary sewer overflows, and failed septic systems. But most of the contamination is from the state's factory farms. How do we know this? Well, first, our State Environmental Agency IDEM's 2020 Water Impairment Report concludes that confined feeding operations are by far the top source of impairment in Indiana streams. And this makes complete sense because livestock generate a lot more waste than humans do. Livestock in the United States generate an estimated 335 million tons of waste annually. That's more than 40 times produced by the human population. Indiana is no different. Our livestock generate as much urine and feces as that produced by 87 million people, or 14 times the human population of Indiana. Now, just because this animal waste comes from livestock doesn't make it any less harmful. Indeed, the pollution strength of raw manure is as much as 110 times greater than that of raw municipal sewage, and is therefore arguably more harmful than human waste, according to the EPA. Even so, under our current regulations, livestock waste is allowed to be stored in unlined earthen lagoons and sprayed untreated on land, whereas human waste has to be treated before it's ever released into the environment. Can you imagine if your neighbor emptied his septic tank by spreading the waste all over his yard? That's exactly what CAFOs are allowed to do under current regulation, but with a lot more waste. Of the 9 watersheds that are tracked in IDEM's water assessment, an average of 98% of stream miles were deemed not suitable for recreational use, i.e. swimming, fishing, because of E. coli contamination. So in other words, our lakes and streams are seriously polluted with animal waste. Another reason that all of us should be concerned about CAFOs is because they pollute our air with noxious emissions, including hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, particulate matter, endotoxins, which is essentially pathogens in the air, and other chemical compounds that pose very serious health risks to humans. For example, a Purdue University study of air emissions at a dairy CAFO in Indiana found that ammonia emissions were released at a rate of between 18 and 75 grams per day per cow. In other words, an average sized dairy CAFO with 4,000 cows will emit as much as 660 pounds of ammonia into the air every day, or 120 tons per year, which is far above the 100 tons per year threshold for regulation under the Clean Air Act. Yet, CAFOs remain unregulated at the federal or state level. These gases are dispersed into the surrounding area where people live in a number of ways. Factory farms that have waste pits underneath the confined buildings, which we see often in hog CAFOs, have very large ventilation fans like you see here that pull the gases out of the building and blow them out into the outside air. And they have to do this or the animals would die. That's how toxic and dangerous the emissions are. Factory farms with open air football field size lagoons, like you see on the bottom right, allow perpetual off-gassing to occur as the waste decomposes. And then when the collected waste slurry is sprayed onto fields, the emissions are directly released into the surrounding air. Of course, common sense tells us that if brief exposure to a mere 60 gallons of urine and feces collected in a typical porta pot is uncomfortable, imagine being exposed to the stench of millions of gallons of urine and feces in a massive pit or lagoon, which could be unbearable and is unbearable, as we've heard from so many families who, through no fault of their own, found out that their new neighbor is a massive factory farm. Another reason we should all be concerned about factory farms is the rise of antibiotic-resistant disease due to the overuse of antibiotics in livestock at factory farms. According to the FDA, approximately 80% of antibiotics sold in the United States are fed to non-diseased livestock at factory farms to promote their growth and ward off the stress and disease caused from living in such unnatural confined conditions. And as confirmed by the Centers for Disease Control, this prophylactic use of antibiotics in livestock has contributed to the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in humans through contamination of our food supply. Some infections now resist multiple antibiotics. One example of this is MRSA, which is a pathogen that now takes more lives each year than HIV/AIDS. And due to this and other serious public health threats posed by CAFOs, the American Public Health Association recently announced a new policy statement advising federal, state, and local governments to impose a national moratorium on all new and expanding CAFOs until these public health concerns are addressed. But if air and water pollution or antibiotic-resistant disease isn't a concern for some folks, maybe the fact that the meat industry is the leading cause of climate change will get their attention. According to the most recent report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, meat and dairy production is now the #1 source of all human-caused greenhouse gases. And here's why. About 70 billion farm animals are raised every year worldwide, more than 10 billion in the US alone. More than 6 million are killed for food every hour. Not surprisingly, these 70 billion farm animals consume a lot of resources, resulting in deforestation, which emits greenhouse gases and removes a carbon sink. Also, because these 70 billion animals produce a lot of waste, that releases methane, a potent greenhouse gas that has a global warming potential 86 times that of carbon dioxide on a 20-year time frame. So at current rates, methane emissions from animal agriculture are projected to increase 80% by 2050, which means that even if we stop using fossil fuels, we'll exceed the 565 gigaton carbon dioxide equivalent limit by 2030, all due to the meat and dairy industry. In addition to being a leading cause of climate change, the meat industry is the largest user of land. 30% of the land surface of the planet goes to raising livestock for food. It's also the leading cause of habitat destruction and species extinction. That's because it takes a heck of a lot of land to grow the amount of grain needed to feed 70 billion animals we raise every year. 16 pounds of grain to make just 1 pound of beef. In the US alone, livestock eat more than 50% of all the grain we produce and use nearly half the land of the contiguous US. The staggering inefficient use of resources is particularly disturbing from a humanitarian perspective, given that we currently grow enough food to feed more than 10 billion people, but 50% of it goes to feed livestock. Also, 82% of starving children live in countries where food is grown to feed livestock that are eaten by people in Western countries. For that matter, it takes 15 times more protein can be produced on a given area of land by growing plants for direct human consumption rather than feeding it to livestock. Raising 70 billion animals requires a lot of water too. Animal agriculture is responsible for nearly 30% of all freshwater consumption in the world and nearly 50% of water used in the US. To give you an example, as it shows on this slide, it takes more than 2,400 gallons of water to produce a pound of meat versus 25 gallons of water to produce a pound of meat. But if destroying the planet doesn't move some people to care about factory farms, maybe their love for animals will. Just like our dogs and cats, the billions of animals raised and killed each year for meat are sentient, complex beings and capable of feeling pain and frustration, joy, and excitement. Yet they are viewed by the meat industry as mere commodities to be produced, and as a result, they suffer a myriad of assaults to their physical, mental, and emotional well-being. Unfortunately, there are no federal laws that protect farm animals from this cruelty, and the majority of states, including Indiana, exempt the industry's, quote, accepted agricultural practices, no matter how abusive, from the scope of their animal cruelty statutes. Simply put, the treatment of factory farmed animals is inhumane and cruel, but legal. For example, chickens are confined by the tens of thousands in grower houses, which are artificially lit, see here, force ventilated and completely barren, except for the long rows of feeders and drinkers. Also, due to selective breeding, these birds grow abnormally fast and large, which causes them to suffer gait defects, broken bones, and severe pain. Once they reach market weight, these birds are stuffed into crates for transport, where they often suffer dislocated, broken hips, legs, and wings, as well as internal hemorrhages. Also, during their journey to slaughter, these birds, just like other factory farmed animals, are not given food or water and are afforded little, if any, protection from extreme temperatures. At the slaughter plant, the birds are uncrated, dumped onto conveyors, and hung upside down in shackles by their legs as they pass through an electrified water bath before their throats are cut, usually by a machine. And due to the rapid speed of the slaughter lines, up to 8,400 chickens per hour, mistakes occur, leaving some birds still conscious as they enter tanks of scalding hot water intended to loosen their feathers. Chickens in the egg industry also suffer immensely, beginning right after hatching. Male chicks are considered useless byproducts to the egg industry because they're unable to lay eggs and are not being bred for meat production. So millions of baby chicks each year are gassed and thrown into garbage bins where they are left to die from dehydration or asphyxiation. Female chicks are mutilated without any pain relief when the tips of their beaks are seared off with a hot blade to prevent them from pecking and engaging in other behaviors that result from intensive confinement. Most egg-laying hens are confined in small wire battery cages that are stacked several tiers high and extend down long warehouses like you see here. In these battery cages, the hens are given less space than the area of a letter-sized sheet of paper in which to eat, sleep, lay eggs, and defecate. This makes it impossible for them to spread their wings or engage in natural behavior such as dust bathing, foraging, or nesting. The more than 235 million pigs that are slaughtered every year in the US don't fare much better. Sows are put through consecutive cycles of impregnation, giving birth and nursing, all while intensively confined. Although pigs are intelligent and highly social animals, pregnant sows are kept in metal gestation crates that are so small that they're unable to even turn around. Then right before giving birth, the sows are moved to equally restrictive farrowing crates designed to keep them from crushing their nursing piglets. The crates are so small, they can only stand up and lie down. And then after the piglets are weaned, the cycle begins again for the mother pig, who churns out an average 2.5 litters each year until she can no longer reproduce and is then sent to slaughter. Cows in the dairy industry endure endless cycles of artificial insemination, mechanized milking, and giving birth. Many are routinely given hormones to increase milk production. The amount of work done by an average dairy cow during peak lactation is so immense, it's comparable to a human jogging for 6 hours every day, almost year-round. And although cows can naturally live for more than 20 years, the average dairy cow is spent and sent to slaughter before she reaches the age of 5. To continue producing milk, dairy cows must continuously give birth, but the male calves are of no value to the dairy industry. So within the first few days of life, male calves are taken from their mothers and raised for veal, where they are intensively confined and tethered in stalls so small they're unable to turn around for their entire 16 to 18-week lives before slaughter. These are just a few of the meat industry's incredibly cruel and inhumane practices that treat animals as commodities for profit instead of living, feeling creatures. But if animal cruelty, climate change, air and water pollution concerns don't get people's attention, the meat industry is also costing our health in terms of obesity, cardiac disease, and other illnesses related to excess meat consumption. Today, the average American eats a lot of meat, roughly 200 pounds per person every single year. That's more than 6 times what the average American consumed in the 1930s. Why is that, you might ask? Well, today it's much cheaper to eat a bacon double cheeseburger than it is to eat a salad. And that's because the meat industry is heavily subsidized, whereas fruit and vegetable growers only get the tiniest sliver of taxpayer help, as you see on this slide. Back in the day, of course, the true cost of eating meat was reflected in the price. For those of you old enough, you might remember that the Sunday roast at Grandma's house was, a rare treat. It wasn't the norm. From a nutrition standpoint, our food subsidies are completely out of whack. As you see up in the top left-hand corner, that's a pie chart essentially that shows what we should be eating, where vegetables and fruits make up half the plate and protein less than a quarter. But the subsidies make up almost, for protein and dairy, meat and dairy, almost the full plate, whereas fruits and veggies, you can barely even see the little sliver of public support that they get. So we can't be surprised that we're producing triple bacon double cheeseburgers and that people are eating unhealthily as a result. This is especially harmful in terms of health outcomes for low-income families who live in food deserts and can't afford to eat healthily. And so after depressing all of you this morning with all of these problems, you might ask, well, gee, don't our laws protect us from these environmental and public health threats? And the answer is no. There are serious gaps in federal and state environmental regulations and public health regulations, and I'll highlight just a few of those. First, the EPA's authority to regulate CAFOs under the Clean Water Act has been gutted by a 2011 federal court decision. As a result of the 25,000 CAFOs that were subject to Clean Water Act permitting, less than 8,000 of them are now subject to that permitting. For a CAFO to be regulated, harm now has to occur first. So in other words, they have to cause a fish kill or actually spill waste into the environment before they're required to get a permit. In Indiana, of the 796 largest CAFOs that were subject to the Clean Water Act, all of them now have left the federal Clean Water Act program and are just regulated under our state confined feeding rule, which is pretty meager, as I'll briefly discuss. Indiana's CFO rule, of course, doesn't consider property values or whether land use or siting decisions are appropriate. There are no limits on CAFO air pollution. And also, there's no requirement that the corporate integrator who owns the animals and is actually the one calling on the shots be disclosed or have any sort of responsibility under the permit. So when things go wrong, there's no liability for the one actually in control. Also, under our state law, manure pits and lagoons of a CAFO can be built in karst terrain, which is where there's close contact with groundwater and wetlands and other sensitive areas. They can be located 100 feet from on-site water wells and property lines, including next to parks and public spaces. There's only a 300-foot setback from surface waters, drainage inlets, sinkholes, and off-site water wells. And of course, very concerning for people who live next to these facilities, a CAFO can be located no matter how large, no matter how many animals, just 400 feet from homes, churches, and schools. And that's from building structure to structure, not the property line. So if your home is essentially 200 feet from your property line, the CAFO can use your property as an easement. The CAFO can then be 200 feet from its property line. And as long as a proposed new or expanding CAFO meets these meager requirements, IDEM has no authority to deny a permit to protect surrounding neighbors. For that matter, our state agency hasn't denied a single permit in the 9 years since the CFO rule was amended in 2012. Also, despite the significant data from numerous scientific and industry-funded studies conducted over decades showing that CAFOs generate noxious odors and produce dangerous air emissions that threaten the health of people nearby, CAFOs remain unregulated under the Clean Air Act, and IDEM CFO rule also lacks any regulatory limits on air pollution from CAFOs. Unfortunately, under the Trump EPA, a final rule was entered under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act that exempts CAFOs from having to report their hazardous air emissions. Congress then passed the Fair Agricultural Reporting Method Act, or the FARM Act, which similarly exempts factory farms from having to report their hazardous emissions under CERCLA, which is our hazardous waste cleanup, governs cleanup of hazardous waste sites. And so these two regulatory moves have left rural communities completely in the dark as to what they're being exposed to from CAFOs. Making matters worse, the Indiana Court of Appeals recently held that Indiana's Right to Farm Act bars all damages claims brought by neighbors who are harmed by CAFOs, even if the neighbors were there long before the CAFO moved in, which is particularly insidious given that the Right to Farm Acts across the country, including in Indiana, were initially intended to protect existing farmers from people moving from the city out to the country next to an existing farm and not liking the smell. But these laws have been, co-opted by the meat industry to shield CAFOs from any liability for the harm they cause. And if you really want to know more about this, I urge you to watch this movie, Right to Harm. Dr. Ikerd appears in the movie that really delves into the damaging effects of having these sorts of right to harm laws on the books. So what can we do? Well, first, we have to demand that our lawmakers undo the bad policies that got us here in the first place and enact new policies that will level the playing field for small independent farmers using regenerative instead of degenerative agricultural practices, which do not include CAFOs. So how do we do that? Well, one way is to end the massive taxpayer subsidies that go to the meat industry and instead reallocate support to farmers who use regenerative practices to grow diverse crops of fruits, vegetables, grains, and livestock sustainably, including financial support, taxpayer support to rebuild the local infrastructure needed so that these farmers can directly serve consumers. And how is that done? Well, we have to get involved in the legislative process and specifically voice our concerns, tell our representatives in Congress what we want to see in the next farm bill, which is when those subsidies get reallocated. The current farm bill was enacted in December of 2018 and it expires in 2023. So we have to start weighing in now, especially with members of Congress who sit on the Senate and House committees on agriculture and nutrition and forestry, who have primary responsibility for drafting the farm bill. All of the specific legislative steps and things, who the contact is all in the citizen guide. The second policy reform we should all get behind is the Farm System Reform Act, which was introduced by Senator Cory Booker. This bill has several co-sponsors in the House and Senate and is supported by more than 300 sustainable farming groups, animal welfare, environmental, and public health organizations, including HEC and the Indiana Farmers Union. What would this bill do? Well, it would strengthen the Packers and Stockyards Act, which is our antitrust law, to crack down on the monopolistic practices of multinational meat packers and corporate integrators. It would place an immediate moratorium on new and expanding large CAFOs and phase out the largest CAFOs by 2040. It would also hold corporate integrators responsible for pollution and other harm caused by CAFOs, and importantly, would provide a voluntary buyout for farmers who want to transition out of operating a CAFO. Again, everything that you want to know about this bill and how to contact your U.S. Senators and House of Representatives is in the Citizens Guide. While we work on national farm policy reform, we also need to focus our attention on reforming state regulation of CAFOs, regardless of what state you live in, so that the meat industry internalizes the true cost of doing business. In Indiana, that state regulatory reform should give our state agency the authority to deny a permit to build or expand a CAFO to protect human health and the environment from the operation's air emissions. As I said earlier, those are not regulated under the current law. We need greater setbacks, at least a mile from homes, schools, businesses, churches, parks, and other public places. And if a setback isn't possible, then the CAFO ought to be required to compensate impacted neighbors for their property value loss, having to move. We should also demand that our state lawmakers give IDEM the authority to regulate air emissions from CAFOs, including hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and particulate matter. We should include a public nuisance provision that would allow IDEM to revoke a CAFO permit if an operation becomes a public health or environmental threat or a nuisance to neighbors. And critically, we should demand that Indiana's Unjust Right to Farm Act be repealed. Everything you need to know to get actively involved in the state legislative process and reform, CAFO reform, is available through HEC's Bill Watch page. Please note that the 2022 legislative session will begin in early January. When it does, we will be spotlighting important bills and calls to action on the Bill Watch page. Please also, if you're not following us on Facebook and Twitter, do so, because we provide real-time updates there. To find your state legislators, you can go to the Indiana General Assembly website and click on Find My Legislator. And also, please do make sure to register for Greening the State House, which is November 19th through 20th, where we will, it's an online event, we'll be spotlighting key legislative issues and how you can get involved. Ultimately, though, it's up for you to decide whether to support an industrial food system or a sustainable one. And you don't have to wait around for policy reform to do it. You can create consumer demand for the sustainable food system we all want by voting with your food dollars. Instead of buying industrially produced meat, dairy, and poultry products at a chain or a big box grocery store, buy it from your local and regional farmers. In Indiana and around the country, there are farmers markets and communities statewide and around the country that connect local consumers to farmers from May through October. In Indiana, there are small farm co-ops and buying clubs such as Purple Porch Co-op, Homestead Heritage, Seven Sons Meat Company, Tyner Pond Farms, and others that connect local Indiana farmers to consumers all year round. Localharvest.org is a searchable database for CSAs and food co-ops if you are having trouble finding access to local farmers near you. And finally, regardless of where you buy your food, if you care about reducing your environmental footprint, one of the most impactful things you can do is at least reduce your consumption of meat, poultry, and dairy. Just to give you some facts and figures on that, if you're a meat eater, it'll take 18 times as much as a vegan, or 3 acres to feed you. If you're a vegan, it takes 1/6 of an acre. If you're a vegetarian, 3 times as much as a vegan, or 1/2 an acre. Also, 1.5 acres can produce 37,000 pounds of plant-based food, or 375 pounds of meat. And each day, a person who eats a vegan diet saves 1,100 gallons of water, 45 pounds of grain, 30 square feet of forested land, 20 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalent, and 1 animal's life. To end my comments, reducing the global demand and consumption of meat and dairy is really the only way that our food system can be sustainable, because at current rates of consumption, it'll take the resources of several Earths to feed the world in 2050, and we only have one. So I'm going to bring in Dr. Ikerd now. Let me stop share. Oh, Dr. Ikerd, welcome.
Hi.
I think I got it all done in just under an hour.
You did great. Very comprehensive. I don't think I've ever heard a more comprehensive treatment of the industrial animal agricultural sector before. So I congratulate you on that. I thought it was very well done.
Well, thank you. I was going to start off with my first question being, were there any of the issues that I covered that you think I got wrong or should be clarified or emphasized?
No, I don't think
or something that you would be add that you,
I don't think there's any you got wrong and you really need to be clarified. The only thing, and I can get into this as well, is I think, ultimately our diet has got to accommodate what nature will provide us here in a sustainable, regenerative way. And I think we need to be willing to adjust to that. I think that would end up being considerably less meat, but I personally think there would be a role for animal agriculture within a sustainable, regenerative future for the food system. But that's not in any way conflicting with what you're saying. I'm just saying that I think we need to start by recognizing that we have to accommodate the needs of the earth if we're going to sustain life on earth.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. And to be clear, I know that food choice is so personal, and at HEC, we're not advocating that people become vegetarian or vegan, but we are making the point that, as you rightfully say, that ultimately we are going to have to reduce meat consumption, not only to reduce demand for the current system, but to live within the Earth's means. So yeah, thank you for that. I want to go back to an email discussion, Dr. Ikerd, that you and I had when we were talking about you joining the panel today. And you pointed out to me that our advocacy on this topic and our concerns about this topic really fit within a larger movement that's going to require us to shift our priorities in order to succeed. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think basically the root cause of all of the environmental problems that you've talked about there and our growing social problems of social inequity, economic inequity within society, they're all rooted in our preoccupation with economic self-interest. I'm an agricultural economist, so that's kind of the perspective I come from. So what I mean is that our pursuit of income and wealth and economic growth, in fact, is the root of the problems that even challenge long-run agricultural sustainability and economic sustainability in general. I think we've lost sight of the fact that everything that's of any use to us as humans, including everything of economic value, ultimately comes from the earth. It comes from the sunshine, the air, the water, the soil, the minerals, the living things in the soil, plants, animals, people. We're all a part of that. There isn't any place else to get anything of use to us or anything of economic value. And we've also lost sight of the fact that the economy is simply a means, an impersonal means by which we realize the inherent value or potential usefulness of the things of nature. You know, if we wanted to return to kind of self-sufficiency, if we wanted to be totally self-sufficient, we could meet our needs directly from nature. There wouldn't be any need for an economy. But if we want to go beyond self-sufficiency, then we have to relate to other people. Now, we could meet our needs within our own communities, our friends, our families, people that we know. But if we want to go beyond that, then that's when we create economies which allow us through transactions, through working for money, buying and selling, to meet needs impersonally from people that we don't know and they don't know us, but they have something we need, we have something they need. The economy allows us to meet those needs impersonally, and that's what it's all about. Now, we need to recognize that if we use up or we destroy or degrade the usefulness of the things of the earth, the natural resources, or if we degrade and destroy the human resources within society, that the means by which we get our usefulness from nature, then we can't sustain the economy. See, sustainability, kind of in the most basic sense, sustainability is about meeting the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for those of the future. So if there's going to be anything left for the future to meet their needs, equal or better opportunities, then the usefulness of those resources have to be there. We can't deplete the soil, the water, the air. We can't destroy the living biological systems that they're going to depend upon. And then we also need to recognize that if society is going to conserve and protect resources for the benefit of the future, we have to meet the needs of people today. That means all the people today. We can't expect people to be concerned about depletion of fossil energy or climate change or issues like that if they don't have a place to live and if they don't have food for their kids to eat or nutritious food to eat. So we've got to get the priorities right. We've got to recognize that the economy is meant to serve the needs of people, impersonal needs of meeting our needs, not the other way around. We're not here to serve the economy. It's here to serve us. And we also need to recognize that we have to accommodate the needs of nature because we can't change the laws of nature. And so we have to look at nature first, as I was suggesting, on changing our diets. And then we say, how do we create a society that fits in harmony with nature, sustainable? Then how do we create an economy then that provides the means by which we carry that out? And it's not only the fact that we're threatening the long run economic sustainability of our society in the process of this preoccupation with economics, but because of the impersonal nature of transactions, economic transactions, we're destroying relationships among people within families, within communities. And we're social beings. We need those relationships with other people for reasons that have nothing to do with what we'll receive in terms of economic value. And we need a sense of purpose and meaning in life. And part of that is taking care of each other and taking care of the earth. It's always been, until we got distracted by this economic self-interest. We just lost our sense of interconnectedness with each other and with the earth, and we're suffering the consequences. Now, if we relate that directly to what we're talking about here in agriculture, in particular in large confinement animal feeding operations, industrial agriculture, I think the best way to put it is in this preoccupation with economic growth, income, and wealth. We basically have turned our rural communities into economic colonies. And economic colonies is kind of what we created after it was determined that the political economies were simply morally and ethically wrong because we were taking advantage of people. But many of those countries are still being exploited economically in the same way that they were exploited politically. And what do we do with colonies? They're areas where we extract and exploit the resources, the natural resources of those areas, the minerals, the water, the air, the soil in places like that in the colony. And we exploit the people that are there. If you look at the previous colonies that were political colonies, economic colonies, you see places with degraded environments, with people, that were never allowed to develop the capacity to develop their own communities and things of this nature. And so that's basically what we've done with rural areas in this country. We've extracted the wealth from the soil, first the mining towns and then the timber towns, and now it's the agricultural towns, as we talked about here, where we've extracted this for the sake of economics. When you read about the report, this was an economic strategy of how we extract the maximum economic value from the resources of the land. And they said we do this by this method of what we're talking about here, industrial agriculture. Industrialization allows you to produce more with fewer people. It's a very efficient means of extracting and exploiting, but there's nothing about it that's regenerative and renewing. And so we've used industrial agriculture, and specifically the large confinement industrial animal feeding operations, as a means of colonizing rural areas and extracting the wealth, not for the benefit of rural people, but for the benefit of the economy, the corporations that you talked about. The people in rural communities get just enough to continue to survive, much as the people did in previous colonies. And we're left with rural communities that now in dissension, they're, as you've heard about here, their environment's been polluted, their resources have been degraded, their farmers have been displaced. We've de-skilled agriculture to the point where it's a low wage, kind of minimum wage job to work in these confinement animal feeding operations. And rural communities are left with a sense of hopelessness and helplessness because the leaders in those countries, those areas, and many of the prominent people are led to believe that this is the only possibility they have for economic development, and economic development is the means by which they're going to lift themselves out of something that economic development has been burying them within. And so we have to challenge that. There are alternatives. There are better alternatives. That's what the sustainable agriculture movement has been about for the past 30 years. All of it, we hear regenerative agriculture. That's what it's about. But that's the perspective I see from. We have to get the priorities right, or we're not going to change the way people think about using the resources and the people in rural areas.
So, Dr. Ikerd, when you talk about the priorities, so I understand what you're getting at with respect to us changing our priorities, but you mentioned to me in our conversation that this has to start with activists themselves, with us. Right. And so where do you see us as activists falling in, not having the correct priorities, or what are you getting at there?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think as activists, as the activist community, we have to recognize that it is the priorities that we have to start with. We have to begin with this idea that we have some purpose for being here. Sustainability assumes that there's some purpose for human life on Earth. Otherwise, why would you want to sustain it? And it also assumes that purpose is good. Because if our purpose here is simply to degrade and deplete the earth and destroy the rest of it, the best thing that can happen for the other living things on earth is for us to go away as quickly as possible. So if we're concerned about sustainability and climate change and fossil energy depletion and all the things that you've talked about here, it assumes that we're here for some useful purpose. And we need to start with that. Too often, and almost universally, what I hear is that people will say, we have to show that there's an economic incentive to do this. We have to show that this alternative is more profitable than the industrial system. Well, the focus on profitability is what got us in this problem to begin with. I don't care what direction you start, and if you're starting off with a better production practice of some sort, even if like grass-based dairy operations, or if you're starting with a vegan diet or vegetables or things of that nature, if you're motivated, primarily motivated by the profit motive of economic exploitation and extraction, you'll end up right back with an unsustainable system. Because if you give the priority to economics, economics is individual. It's about meeting the needs of the individual, not a community, not a society, not as a whole. It's about the individual. It's impersonal, as I explained. It's kind of an impersonal transaction. If a particular person doesn't make any difference. And it's instrumental. It's a means to an end. And as a consequence of that, economic value is always short term. That's the reason when you talk about economic decisions, people will talk about we've got to discount things back to the present value. Because the further you go into the distance, the less valuable something is, because if you're going to have to wait to get something in the future rather than to have it today, there's always a risk you won't get it or you won't enjoy it as much into the future. Or if you can get something today, then you can invest it. If you can buy a house today, you can live in it. So if you talk about from an economic perspective, it always puts a heavy premium on the present relative to the future. And there's absolutely no economic value in doing anything for somebody of some future generation because you'll never get anything back on that. You know it to begin with. And there's really no benefit, economic benefit, in doing anything for the sole benefit of anyone else. You know, if you're expecting to get something back, that's not purely altruistic. That's just an economic decision. So if we don't get away from saying everything has to give a priority to economics, we're never going to move off of this thing of continuing to stay on this treadmill of starting off in one direction, and it turns out to be the same place, we end up in the same place we started from. And I think a lot of the non-profit organizations and philanthropic organizations, it's well-meaning because they know that people today are motivated by economics, or at least they feel they should be rationally motivated by economics. And so they try to rationalize everything in terms of this is going to benefit you economically, when we should be talking about this is what we need to do in order to fulfill our purpose and meaning here, in order to have positive relationships with other people within communities, in order to rebuild our society, in order to gain, you know, some sense of worthiness. We need those things in order to make our lives good.
So you're suggesting not that the policy proposals that a few of them I mentioned earlier, not that those are necessarily the wrong things to fight for, right, but in making the arguments for them, right, we need to remember why we're arguing for them. Is that what you're getting at?
Absolutely. When you talk about policies, the fundamental purpose of government is to do those things that don't make economic sense, but they're good for society as a whole. If they make economic sense, then just let the markets do them. That's perfectly fine. If something's good, there's a lot of good things for nature and for society that do make economic sense, and the markets will do those. And so we need to just let the markets perform in those areas. But the areas you mentioned in which we have public policies, those are to do things, to facilitate things that the markets won't do. So the reason that you went back and you explained very well, I hadn't seen that particular report, but I knew the whole philosophy of the change in policy in the really started in the 60s, but it evolved out of the 50s, as you indicate here. That change in policy was rationalized by the government people. The corporations may have had a totally different agenda, but it was rationalized that this is going to be for the public good, because the idea was if we make agriculture more efficient, it's going to bring down the cost of production. It's going to bring down the cost of food, as we talked about here. That was the economics I was taught, and that was the economics I believed for the first half of my 30-year academic career. and it was going to be good for everybody. It was going to create profit opportunities for innovative farmers that would be good for prosperous rural communities. Now, there were people like the Farmers Union you quoted there said, no, we don't want to give up our communities. It isn't just about economics. It's about culture. It's about family farms. It's about tradition. But the prevailing thing was that's just old-fashioned, naive, idealistic. We need to focus on the economic bottom line. And the general assumption among economists was that people in rural areas, the farmers, there's something more productive they can do in society. So if we free them from farming, as they used to talk, free them from the drudgery of farming, then they can go to work with better jobs in the factories and offices of the booming industrial economy. So it was all perceived that government was doing something that was going to serve the common good, and that the markets, if they did it, they wouldn't do it fast enough. So we needed to have government involved. But we're at a point now where it should be obvious to anyone. I thought one reason I'm continuing to do this 20 years after I retired is economists ought to know better. You know, agricultural economists should look back and say, even if that was well-intended policy, it was a failure. It didn't do what we intended it to do. It didn't feed the hungry people. We brought down the percentage of income we spend on food between the 1970s and 1990s. But since then, the percentage has leveled out, and actually food prices have gone up faster than the overall inflation rate, basically because the corporations are stepped in and gotten control of the food system. And so even if farm level prices have continued to decline, then what we've seen is the food processors and distributors have taken a bigger share, so that food prices have gone up. And the worst part of it is we haven't fed the hungry. We have a higher percentage of people that are classified as food insecure today than the best estimates back in the late 60s when CBS did the documentary Hunger in America. They estimated that 5% of the people in the country was hungry, and it was considered a national emergency. The last report, 2020 and the year before, about 11% of the households in the U.S. are classified as food insecure, and about 14% of 1 out of 7 households with children are food insecure. It's an absolute disgrace. We failed to provide food security. We failed. And our rural communities are in economic and social decline and decay. We talk about rural communities. Wall Street Journal ran a feature article called Rural Communities, the New Inner Cities, on a whole range of socioeconomic criteria. Rural communities rank below the inner cities out of a classification of 4 or 5 different areas. We talk about rural ghettos. You know, we didn't have alternative means of economic development of rural communities to replace family farming, because these were exploitive, extractive processes. That's what industrialization is about, a very efficient means of exploiting and extracting the wealth from places. So we've been recognized that those policies were failures, and we need to make a fundamental change in policy. And I argue that our technology, our ability to farm sustainably, and there's a whole range of them, whether it's authentic organic farming, biodynamic farming, ecological farming, regenerative farming, holistic resource management, permaculture, nature farming. There's a whole range of these that fit under the umbrella of sustainability. There's farmers out here, and the whole knowledge base is much further along today than our ability and our knowledge of how to farm industrial was back in the 50s and 60s. If we had a fundamental shift in policies away from subsidizing, supporting, and stepping in every time there's a disaster in the industrial system, there's going to be disaster after disaster because it's very efficient, but it's very vulnerable. It's lacking in resilience. And so government programs offset that lack of resilience. But anyway, if we had a shift in policy, we could have a revolution in agriculture that would transform it in a hurry.
So I have a couple of follow-up questions, and then I want to bring our audience in because I know they have a lot of questions for you too. What we're talking about here is huge, right? I mean, this is a really big systemic problem. And I know, certainly for just for me as an attorney with a lot of knowledge about this, there are times that I get overwhelmed. So I know that certainly people who may be new to this topic or have been fighting this fight for a long time just feel like, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. What advice would you give to our attendees about their advocacy, about what is the most important thing that they can do in order to make a difference on this issue?
Well, I give them the same advice I try to give myself. It goes back to the idea of purpose. Life doesn't make any sense if there's no purpose. If there's nothing in particular that we ought to do, then there's nothing in particular that we ought not to do. It just doesn't make any difference. I say, if there's no purpose to life, why get up in the morning? But again, why not? So I really believe that life doesn't make sense unless there's some purpose, and it's not some. I think it's kind of a it's kind of a path that we need to walk. And my advice is if we have a sense, if we feel what we should do, what we can do, I think it's reflected in our ability, it's reflected in our passions, the things that make us feel good, the things that we feel like we've done a decent job of it, or somehow we get some sense of reward out of doing something that we feel is right and good. And no matter how small that might seem to you or to someone else, if that's what we ought to do, I'm convinced that we will have made the greatest contribution that we possibly could have made just by doing our part. And if we think, well, that little part isn't big enough that we want to go off and do something really big, we'll probably just mess things up because we're trying to do something we wasn't meant to do, and we'll get in the way of other people and things of that nature. So I may be wrong, but I think it's a pretty good way to live. And that's what I try to do. I try to get up in the morning and say, okay, like this morning, I say, okay, what can I do here? I'm going to try to do whatever I can do. And then I'm going to trust that whatever happens is what needs to happen and let it go with that. So I think regardless of whether you are in the activist area, whatever you're doing, if you're stuffing envelopes, or if you're out making presentations, or if you're out knocking on doors, or if you're arguing in a courtroom, if it's your place, then that's what you need to be doing. And I just trust that if we each do our part, then together we're going to create something fundamentally better. Because I think that's what we're here to do. I think that's our intention. That's ultimately our purpose, is to contribute to the greater good of something.
Right. Could you speak to how that relates to larger social movements, Dr. Ikerd, and specifically, I'm thinking of a conversation that you and I had in referring to Bill Moyer's book about how social movements take time.
Right.
And yeah, could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and in that book, and it was really revealing to me as well, because Bill Moyer had been around when he wrote the book for 30 or 40 years, going all the way back to peace movement, the anti-nuclear movement, anti-war movement, the whole range environmental movement, and so on. And he had lived through that long history, and he pointed out, and I can see the same thing in the history that I've lived through, is that social movements take a long time. It takes a long time for people to shift out of this, what I talk, the preoccupation with economics, to the final realization that isn't working, it isn't going to work, and then begin to move away and see, okay, there's alternatives here, so let's move in this direction. And as he points out in the book, and I've seen this, there'll be times when it seems like you're really moving forward and you're really making progress. And then they come in and push you back, because there's always defenders of the status quo. Change is difficult and change is threatening to the people that are benefiting. And right now we've got a major challenge in these large corporations. They're not even people. They have no sense of ethics or social responsibility. They're purely economic organizations. And so they're always going to be pushing back. But we, the people, have to continue to push back. The only power in this country that's greater than corporate power is the power of the people. But we have to be prepared then that we're going to have periods of time when it appears that we're moving forward, and then we're going to be pushed back. And then periods of time we're moving forward, and then we'll be pushed back. And you've seen this in what I call the CAFO wars, the long run CAFO war, we win some battles and we think that we've got some legislative changes and we get some things done, and then the other side fights back. If you watch the film, the documentary Right to Harm, you see about the people in North Carolina that, suffered from CAFOs for decades, and they finally won a court battle, and won a settlement against the big CAFO operators. And then the legislature comes in and basically changes the rules. It makes it almost impossible for anybody else to do what they've done. So you just have to continue to fight the battle. And as far as industrial agriculture and CAFOs are concerned, ultimately that's a battle for the hearts and minds of people. Once we change public perceptions, once we change the public attitudes about tolerating this particular kind of agricultural system, and if it becomes intolerable to the public, and I think presentations like yours, if we had a lot more people out here doing that, it's pretty hard to argue against that this is kind of agricultural system we want. But once we change public opinion, then political opinion will change. Political opinion, in my opinion, always follows public opinion. So we're going to have the ebb and the flow, and we need not to lose heart when we lose a battle or we got a setback. We just need to continue to do what we think we ought to do. And I think eventually, if we're on the right, if we're moving toward, I agree with Martin Luther King, the arc of history is long, but it bends in the direction of justice and goodness. And so I think we have to trust in that and just keep at it.
That's wonderful advice. I want to start turning to some of the questions that we've got in the chat box now, Dr. Ikerd, if that's all right with you, unless you have something else you'd like to add on this discussion that we've been having.
No, that's fine. Let's go to the questions.
Okay, I'm just going to start at the top. One of the questions is, without factory farms, will everyone need to grow feed? I could answer that one, but I'm going to punt it to you.
Okay. What I was talking about was all these different various versions of sustainable agriculture, and many of those are very progressive and very well developed. I'm not talking about everybody growing food. I think everybody ought to grow food just so they understand what's involved in the process. Even if you've just got a couple of tomato plants, you get some sense of what farmers are facing that are actually trying to grow tomatoes, and how it can be wiped out and how difficult it is and things of that nature. And I think it's good. I've got my wife and I have a 4x8 raised bed that I get all the greens that I can possibly eat out of that. And I think that's good. But that's not what I'm talking about in replacing industrial agriculture. I'm talking about small to mid-sized farms that are farmed regeneratively, that are, instead of being specialized, standardized, consolidated, and controlled, which is the kind of the characteristics of industrial agriculture. These farms are diversified rather than specialized. They're individualistic and tailored to a particular place and particular people, rather than being standardized or highly mechanized. They use technology, but appropriate technology to their size and in their function. And instead of being consolidated or concentrated in terms of control into large corporate organizations, they cooperate, they network. When people are always talking about, they've got this idea, well, we have to have systems that will scale up. When people talk about scale up, they're basically talking about we've got to industrialize it. It's like we have to centralize it so it'll become larger and we can control larger units. And what I'm talking about is networking out through cooperative and collaborative relationships. And I think it starts by relocalizing the food system, by creating more localized, bioregional, or even local food systems, and where you can basically insulate yourself, if not isolate yourself, from the global market. So you can do things, through the market in various other ways. You can show preference for local farmers that are farming sustainably. I've even argued for we need to use the idea of public utilities to create a space, kind of insulation for local food systems from the art thing. But anyway, you can do things within your local community that show preference for the kind of agriculture you want. And there's a whole global movement called the food sovereignty movement, which is all about that, saying local people control their food system. And so you create these community-based food systems that are based on these relationships of trust, personal relationships. And then you link up communities, different communities that share these same common core values of diversity and individuality and cooperation. And so you could develop bioregional, national, even global networks of local food systems, bioregional food systems that are not purely subject to the marketplace, but that are tied together by a commitment to ecological, social, and economic integrity. And then at some point, you begin to be able to put government regulations and laws in place that allow those communities to protect themselves from the marketplace. And so you're using the market then in the sense where it's not degrading things or depleting resources, but you're relying on something other than market incentives in addition to make those organizations go. It's the idea that you decide how you want a farm that's good for the land and good for the people, and then you find a way to make that work economically. It's back to the priorities again. We have to start with what do we need to do to accommodate nature at this particular place, and then how do we create strong relationships, because we've got to have a strong society to support, that care of nature, and then we create an economy that will accommodate that. It's not that you're depriving people of the economic means of making a decent living. It's just that you're finding a way to do that that's socially and ecologically responsible. And so I think it's not a matter of going back to self-sufficiency or even going back to purely personal relationships. It's creating a new and different food system.
Okay. So the answer to her question was no, we're not going to all have to grow our own feed.
Right. No
Okay.
was the short answer.
Yes. This same person asked, if animal waste is so bad, why is it spread on gardens and farm fields?
The problem is it's the concentration of it. If you think about what we're doing with human waste, if you're out here on a farm in the countryside, if you've got a well-functioning septic tank, that's just fine because you're out there kind of by yourself. But if you're going to build a mobile home park, or you're going to have an apartment complex out somewhere that's not on a municipal waste thing, you're going to have a community level waste thing because you're concentrating more human waste. And if you're going to have a city, like most of these CAFOs are the equivalent, even the 2,500 head is equivalent to like 7,000 to 10,000 people. If you're going to have that many people in one place, then you've got to have a municipal waste treatment facility to take care of that waste properly, not just spread it on the ground, as you talked about before. So it's the matter of concentration of the waste. And the thing is when we had the animals out on diversified family farms where the crops were grown on the same farms where it was fed to the livestock, then you could get the manure back to the fields where the crops were grown, and you always had less manure in terms of nutrients than the nutrients that you actually needed, unless the crop was fixing some of it by itself, because you're exporting some of the nutrients off of the farm in terms of meat, milk, eggs, and that sort of thing. So you were never in a situation where you had more manure than you needed, as long as you had these diversified family farms that we had before. So actually up until 2017, I think it was, correct me on that, look it up, we were not producing any more hogs in this country number-wise than we were back in the 1970s. We had just concentrated them all in the same place. And we were creating far more environmental problems and water quality problems and odor issues and things of that nature in the 2017 than we were back in the 1970s, because back then the hogs were scattered out across the land. So it's a matter of concentration. When you put too much waste in one place, then you have to have a sophisticated waste treatment thing. I've been in discussion with CAFO operators, and they say, well, our waste treatment facilities are so much better than they were on those family farms out here, that they were letting their hogs run outside and that sort of thing. I said, yeah, but they need to be, and they need to be a lot.
Uh-oh, you're frozen, Dr. Eichard.
We've had a fourfold increase in impaired waters in the state of Iowa since the late 1990s, when we moved away from having family farms, hog farms, to moving to the concentrated animal feeding operations. The facts are there.
Great. I couldn't have answered that better myself. I'm just going to keep punting these questions to you, Dr. Ikerd.
Well, you take some of them.
Well, I'm going to give you this one as well. I think it's an important question. How do we increase equitable food access for populations that are low income?
Right.
And I touched on that a little bit in my presentation, but I don't think I spent enough time on that question.
Well, I think that's another area in which we've got to recognize that policies, though they're well intended, haven't worked. I quoted the hunger, food insecurity figures. And I think what we have to recognize is we can't rely on markets. And I've talked about community food utility idea that I've been promoting, but I start that by saying hunger is a market failure. Markets will not feed poor people. They'll not feed poor people in this country, and they won't feed poor people in other countries. And if you look at it now, I quoted the food insecurity statistics. We've been burning about 40% of our corn crop in our cars, turning it into ethanol, as you mentioned before. Why are we doing that? Because we affluent people will pay more for ethanol to put in our gas tanks than poor people can afford to pay for that same land to divert it to producing food. And we're talking about feed the world, but we don't export to the hungriest countries of the world because they don't have money. Something like less than 0.5% of our exports go to the 19 hungriest countries in the world. So the markets won't feed poor people. So the programs that we have now, the government programs, are even going around, okay, we'll just give people money and then we'll leave it to the market. Well, there's always going to be the corporate advertiser that'll convince poor people to spend their money on junk food and tell them they don't have time to prepare food and things of that nature. And so they end up, not getting a nutritious diet or various other things. I tell people you're always going to have food deserts as long as you leave, the distribution of food to the large corporations. So what do? We take it out of the marketplace. We put it back into the communities. What I've talked about with community food utilities is devolving sort of the current government subsidies for food. We've already recognized that feeding the hungry is a legitimate public service. We allocate funds for it. A big share of the Department of Agriculture budget goes to that, but it still isn't doing the job. So let's relocalize those, like I was talking about relocalizing the food system, and let's move those into the community and let them go be administered through a public utility that is committed to producing food sustainably and securing sustainably produced food for local people and nutritious food. And we start from the basis that 85% of what we spend on food today is not for the food itself. It's not what farmers get. In fact, over 85% is for processing, transportation, advertising, packaging, this sort of thing. We can minimize the amount of that, and we need to relocalize our processing or regionalize our processing facilities and make them more efficient as well. But we can, if we relocalize that, and then if we take on the responsibility of ensuring food security by making sure everybody knows how to prepare food and select food, and that everybody gets enough good food. For example, if you're willing to put your SNAP payments or whatever your government food assistance programs into the public utility, the community guarantees that they are going to get enough safe, wholesome, nutritious food for themselves and their children, regardless of how much money goes in. You're not leaving it to the market. We will never feed the hungry. We'll never have food security until we decide as a people that we care enough to make sure that nobody goes hungry.
Right. And I'll just reemphasize again that right now we are subsidizing cheap food, cheap processed meat, processed foods, corn syrup, soy, and a very tiny sliver of our subsidy goes to producing healthy fruits and vegetables. So we could make it less, it's out of whack. I showed that the two different plates where we have the dietary recommendations and what we're actually subsidizing. So if we were subsidizing healthy foods, they would be cheaper.
The thing I would add to that, we need to be subsidizing healthy food systems.
Right.
Because I pointed out, I did work with some folks on an HBO documentary called The Weight of the Nation, and they were saying, well, we just subsidize fruits and vegetables. I say, okay, you just subsidize fruits and vegetables, you're going to end up with junk fruits and vegetables that have no nutrition left, that are produced in an erosive environment, that are exploiting fossil energy and all kinds of stuff. If you just let the market drive it and determine it,
Right. Good point.
Anyway, so I agree with you. We need to subsidize healthy food systems. We need to subsidize healthy farming systems, and we need to subsidize healthy food systems.
Great. See, I learned something on that. I thought I had the answer there, and
well, I don't know.
You set me straight.
I've made a lot of it. I've changed my mind a lot in my lifetime. So I don't ask anybody to just simply believe what I say. I just throw out ideas for people to think about, and I try to think about other people, when they bring up something. You brought up some really good points I hadn't thought about. I hadn't seen that report that you were talking about, the economic development report. I knew the underlying philosophy, but I didn't know exactly where it came from.
Right. I was shocked by it when I ran across it. Okay, so here's another question. How can we convince these growers to change their ways? Is it lack of education, cultural programming, money, or a combination thereof? And how can the general population work towards these changes? I think you've touched on some of this, but I think to the extent that we need to engage in convincing growers to change their ways as opposed to convincing ourselves and taking charge of our food system. What would you say to that, to the extent that we need to do that?
I agree that we need to, work toward voting with our money, buying food that's produced in an ecological, socially responsible way, but also voting in the voting booth. We need to do both of those things. But as far as, changing the farmers, I think, once again, it begins with a change in the head. Tom Frensman, who's a farmer here in Iowa, he used to talk about, he says, if you begin by changing your mind, your behind will follow. But it starts with a change in the head, that somebody says, okay, I need to change what I'm doing. I don't feel comfortable with what it is, and I need to move in a little bit different direction. But I want to say to begin with that I empathize with the industrial agriculture people, including the CAFO operators, because if they look to people they should be able to trust, and the government officials, the people in USDA, the state departments of agriculture, the land grant universities, the big farm organizations like the Farm Bureau, Farmers Union has a very different philosophy, as you pointed out here, but if they look to people that they're looking to as leaderships in the area, they're telling them this is the future of agriculture. I just wrote a critique of what's called the Eat Lancet report. You talked about, shifting away to a meat diet, but their whole premise was, when they talk about agriculture of the future, is agricultural intensification. They're just saying, let's just do industrial agriculture better. And so that's what the farmers that have the large farming, that's what they're hearing from people they should be able to believe. And so when you and I or somebody else comes out and talks, this isn't working, they're saying, are all those experts wrong? I say, yes, they are. But it's hard to convince them. And the other thing is once you're out here on the farm and you've got all this money invested in machinery, if you're a crop farmer, or you've just borrowed $1 million or $2 million to build a CAFO, it's pretty hard to convince you that you've made a big mistake. And even if you made a big mistake, what are you going to do about it? They're talking young farmers. They say, okay, CAFO is the way we get young farmers that can stay on the farm and things of this nature. And so if the corporate contractor goes to the bank with a prospective young CAFO operator and says, okay, we can give them a contract over years, and this is what they're going to make, this is their business plan, it's going to pencil out. And by the way, the government will guarantee 80 to 90% of the loan. What's the banker going to do? The banker's going to say, hey, this is great. This is safe. And so once that young farmer signed that contract, once they signed that loan, they're locked in for 20 years or whatever the length of the loan is. It's going to take them about that long to pay it off when they're producing under a contract operation, typically. So, they can't be convinced. Really, they're going to fight every way they can. There are a very few CAFO operators that have shifted out, but most of them were coming to the end of the period of time when they were going to have to remodel buildings or something to keep their contract. So it's very difficult to shift. Or if you're talking about a crop farmer, they've got all this money invested in specialized machinery that'll harvest corn and soybeans. They can't do much of anything else with it. Or right now, they've got hundreds of thousands of dollars invested in these computer-driven tractors that are guided by GPS systems and all of that. Well, what are you going to do when you say, okay, go back to farming 100 acres or 60 acres rather than 5,000 acres? So you're kind of caught in this system. So it's very hard to change. I think the best opportunities to change, as you pointed out, most of the farmers are not large farmers. It's just the relatively few very large farmers that are producing most of the crops and are producing most of the livestock. But in terms of the numbers of farms, most of the other farms, the 80%, 90% of the farmers, are relatively small, mid-sized farms. Most of those are part-time operations where most of the family incomes comes from somewhere other than farming, but they hold on to the farming operation and they haven't grown larger, and probably those are people that are more susceptible to saying, if I could find a way to make this 180 acres or 300 acres really work, and I could do that in a way I'd feel good about, where I was taking care of the land, being a responsible community member, then that might be the best opportunity to really transition toward regenerative, sustainable systems of people that are in that category. But I think the best hope is if young people, I come across all sorts of young people, young families that really want to farm. They say young people don't want to work, they don't want to farm. Well, that's just contrary to what I see at the big conferences all across the country, the Upper Midwest Organic Growers Conference with Pennsylvania Association of Sustainable Agriculture, Eco Farm Conference in California, Acres, Eco Agriculture Conference going to be in Cincinnati. But, there's young people, young families in all of these that are trying to find some way to get into agriculture. All we really need is a change in policies that will give them access to land, give them an opportunity to farm, absorb the risk of them getting started or farmers transitioning, use the government subsidies to absorb the risk of them transitioning, getting started into sustainable agriculture systems instead of absorbing the risk of the massive failures in this current industrial food system. You mentioned more than $50 billion last year went in farm subsidies because of the disruption of the pandemic and then the disruption of trade. And farmers last year ended up having near record farm level incomes for the big farms that we paid $50 billion. That's about $50,000 per commercial farm that the government paid out just because we created this disruptive industrial system of agriculture that's inherently lacking in resilience. Anytime you push more and more toward efficiency, you're going to sacrifice resilience. It becomes more risky as it becomes more efficient. That's just a basic fundamental law of nature. That's the reason you diversify in order to diversify risk. That's what it means. You specialize, consolidate, it becomes more risky. Our farms have become too big to fail, just like our banks are too big to fail. We need to stop this nonsense and start using our public funds to support things that are really good for society and the future of humanity.
Right. So just to bring it full circle to the two federal policies that I mentioned in my presentation, one was the Farm Bill and everybody weighing in there. You're suggesting that we, again, reallocate our subsidy dollars away from industrial producers to healthy local food, regional local food systems, sustainable, regenerative local food systems. So go ahead.
I'll give you a link that you can, put on the website or wherever. I work with a group of young people, including one progressive farmer here in Iowa as well, but mostly young people called Data for Progress, the Center for Data for Progress. But we developed a policy statement. I think they call it a memo or something like that, but basically a comprehensive policy statement called Regenerative Agriculture and the Green New Deal, where we kind of outlined, a feasible process of transitioning programs away from support of industrial agriculture towards support of regenerative alternatives. So there's already people working on that. It's not just us, it's a lot of other people that are working on the same thing.
Right. And the Farm System Reform Act that Cory Booker has put forward, it has dollars in there that will help CAFO owners transition away from being CAFO operators as well. So that would help with
the problem I mentioned a while ago with people that are stuck into that system. It would give them an out, which I think is a really good proposal.
Right. There were a couple of questions about where in the legislative process that bill is. And I know it was introduced initially in 2019. I think there are companion bills in the Senate and the House, and we're still just trying to get enough co-sponsors on those bills in order to get a hearing. There's a link in the citizen guide that we've sent to all the attendees that where you can read up on that bill. and get more information about where it is in the process and who you need to contact. So I just wanted to mention that because there were several questions about it. Dr. Eichard, here's a topic that I didn't talk about, and I don't think we've talked about that in our discussion. Could you talk about the exploitation of agricultural workers in our current system?
Yes, absolutely. It's part of this whole idea that we've got to have cheap food. We've got to minimize the overall cost of food rather than paying farm workers a living wage and providing them with the benefits, which would have very little impact actually on consumer food prices. It might have a major impact on the profitability of the big fruit and vegetable operations that depend upon migrant labor and cheap migrant labor, but it would have very little impact on the overall cost of food. But it's this whole idea that that's the only way that we can minimize cost of production, because they're saying most people don't want to work in those kind of jobs for the kind of wages that they're paying, and so that's where we end up with immigrant labor. And there's nothing wrong with immigrant labor. I've said if there's anything good about CAPOs, it's adding racial and ethnic diversity to rural communities that didn't exist before. So it's not the matter of whether it's immigrant labor, it's the fact that they're subject to exploitation because they are immigrant labor and because they're afraid to object, afraid they lose the jobs and they get sent back home and various other things. And so they're ripe for exploitation, and that's what they do is in terms of exploiting them. And so I think that's another situation where we simply need to, say we don't want people treated that way. We've had the farm workers union that have come along, and they've had the great boycott that was successful, but basically the big corporations beat them back. What you were talking about in terms of breaking up the corporate power is tremendously important in changing a lot of these things. But I'll just give you one example. I knew Jim Cochran out in California, and this was been in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think it was late 90s when I was talking to him, and he just shifted over to where he was paying all of the workers on his strawberry operation, as I say, the biggest organic strawberry in the operation in California or in the country at that time, that he was paying them all union scale and paying them a living wage and giving them vacations and sick leave and the whole range of things that were in the contract. And so Jim just simply went to his various customers and he says, okay, this is what I want to do for my workers, and this is what it's going to add to a cost of a box of strawberries. And he said his sales actually went up once he explained that what he was doing to his customers, and his customers cared about what they were buying. And so I think if somehow we could create an alternative again where we'd say, okay, this product is coming from farm workers that are being treated well, that they have paid a living wage, that they have vacation, sick leave, and things of that nature. And here's how much more it's going to cost. If we had that option in the marketplace, a clear option, I think that whole sector would grow and we could deal with this issue. The problem is the industry don't want to have that clear distinction. They're going to argue that we're not exploiting our workers and all that kind of stuff. So just like when they talked about using GMOs and not using GMOs, we don't want the people to know because they might imply that what we're doing is wrong. Well, if it's wrong, well, let the people decide if it's wrong. But I think that's where we are on that. And if you pay people a living wage and don't mistreat them, then we need to pay the cost of food. That's part of the cost of food I talked about before, that we need to look at what nature will give us, and we need to look at what society needs, and we need to adjust our eating habits and what we eat and don't eat and what we buy and don't buy to accommodate nature and to accommodate the needs of a civil and just, equitable society. And that's getting the priorities right again. If we get the priorities right, everything else falls in line, but it's not going to be easy. I tell people this country, the United States of America, and I've traveled a little bit around the world, is going to be the most difficult place in the world to do what we're talking about, because except for the African Americans and Native Americans, we have people that by and large come to this country to get rich. And we're descendants of those people. And so it's, we're really ingrained in this economic priority within our society, but I think we still think we can change it once we decide that we have to. Just real quickly, I've concluded that people don't make really big changes like we're talking about here unless there's three things in place. First, I think they have to come to the conclusion that what they're doing isn't working and it isn't going to work in the future. That's what I was talking about. Agriculture intensification is just more industrialization as far as I'm concerned. It isn't going to work. I can't tell you why, but it isn't going to work. So I'm convinced that it isn't working, it isn't going to work in the future. The next is you have to have some idea of what to change to. And that's where we struggle now. When I was talking about these alternative agricultural systems, with a little bit of government help, we could prove very quickly that there's alternatives that we can change to. Not only to feed people in this country, but to feed the world. 70–80% of the people in the world today are not fed by industrial agriculture. They're fed by small, what we would call mostly subsistence farms. And we know through research globally that through systems like agroecology and the food sovereignty movement, that we could double or triple yield on those farms. And so there's alternatives to move through, but people have to believe that. And the third thing is they have to have hope. They have to believe that we can get from here to there. And so I think that's the challenge that we face, is to convince people. I think we're doing a good job of saying, okay, what we're doing now isn't working. It's becoming pretty obvious. There is some glimmer of alternatives. We've got to convince people to make the transition. And I'm convinced that we can, because we have to.
Right. Well, I'll just add to that some hope. The fact that we have more than, I think, 50 some odd participants on a Saturday morning to come and listen to us yammer on about this topic is very hopeful.
Thank you.
And I know that I'm sure you'll agree. I've seen, and I've only been involved in this for about 15 years, you much longer. I've seen the movement of people, the number of people increase dramatically in recent years, people who care very deeply about this issue.
Yeah.
And so,
let me just add, the sustainable agriculture movement back in the late 80s, when I got involved, nobody had ever really heard of sustainable agriculture. Organic was the old word. Nobody wanted to talk about it. I'll just say very briefly, we've just made tremendous progress in public awareness since then. Right.
Absolutely. So, and I'll add on top of that, if you're feeling hopeless, I think we need only look at the civil rights movement and how long that took, and how persistent, women's rights movement, any of the major social movements, and how long that took, but how, a persistent group of people going at it every day, speaking out, and doing exactly what you said, Dr. Ikerd, doing their part, doing the one thing that they could do, brings about that change. And so I hope, at least if there's anything that folks on our call today take away from this, it's that. I want to ask you, well, here's a question for both of us. Kim and John, I'm sure you've both personally experienced the challenge and frustration that arises when giving truthful information is not sufficient to challenge misinformation. Can you share some of the strategies you have evolved in the face of this? Why don't you take it first? You'll probably answer it more eloquently than I.
I haven't found a way to change people's minds. I think the big thing is what we're dealing with now are differences, in many cases, differences in worldview of how the world works and our place within it. The industrial worldview is the world works like a big machine, and that we operate that machine, and that machine extracts wealth from the earth. That's very simple. The alternative worldview I'm coming from is the world's like a big living organism, and we're a part of that. And we have to learn to accommodate the organism we're a part of and do our part to make it productive and useful for us as well as everything else. And so if you're talking to somebody that has this alternative worldview, my truth doesn't make the same sense to them as it does to me. They're reaching it from a different perspective. So all I know to do is to humbly say, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. And then trust that if that makes sense to them, they'll change. And if it doesn't, then they won't.
Right. Well, I'll only add that one thing that works for me is to know that I've done my homework, to know that I have sound data and resources to back up what I'm saying. And if I keep saying it enough, then and I maintain that credible message, people will start doubting the misinformation and looking twice at voices that aren't backed up with good science and data. So I agree with you. I don't know how great all that is in changing a particular person's mind, but ultimately, the truth is the truth, and that's what we have to speak. We are down to our last 4 minutes. Let me scroll through. This is a real good question, definitely for you, given your knowledge of land grant universities. The question is, does Purdue's ag program teach or advocate these sustainable policies? If not, how can we change that? And I'll just add to the question, in my experience, Purdue does not do a very good job in talking about these policies, but you probably have some insight into that.
I can't talk specifically about Purdue, but the land grant university is kind of part of what I call the agricultural establishment that kind of bought into this idea that it's all about improving the efficiency of agriculture. And they've adopted sort of the industrial approach, and I suspect they'll continue to pursue sort of agricultural intensification, which is just, we'll find out a way to do industrial better. I suspect that's where they're going to end up. But virtually all the land grant universities have been forced over the years through public pressure to have some sort of sustainability program or sustainable agriculture program. Purdue University, I did I was really surprised. I did a couple of conferences with their small farm program a few years back, that I was really surprised with the credibility and the focus they had there, but I understand that they've transformed that program into something different since. So I can't speak for what it is today, but you know, what I find is within the land grant university system, you'll find in individuals that are really doing good sustainable agriculture work, and they're usually doing it in addition to everything else they have to do to maintain their position and their responsibilities. And so if you can find those individuals within the universities, but typically they're not getting much support from the university to do that. And so they're really dedicated people. So I encourage you to support those individuals, even if the universities are not supportive. And eventually what will change the university is public pressure again. It's when the people stand up, as I've argued, these should be the people's universities. Public institutions are people's university. You go into Walmart and you got $100 and I got $1, you get 100 times as much stuff. But if you go into the dean's office and you got 100 and I got 1, I'm just as important as you are, because I'm a citizen of the state and a citizen of the country.
Wonderful. In our very last minute, Dr. Ikerd, on the point of changing people's minds, you shared with me, and I know it's no secret, that you once promoted the very policies that we're advocating against. What converted you, if you can do that quickly? What changed your mind?
Well, I never lost sight of the end I was trying to pursue. It was about helping rural people. It was about trying to do some good in the world, you know, and I never lost sight of that. And I always continued to reevaluate what I was doing relative to what I wanted to accomplish. And when I saw that what I was doing wasn't accomplishing what I wanted to accomplish, but I think too often people get tied up in being very successful in what they're doing, and then they lose sight of the fact that they aren't accomplishing what they intended to accomplish. But if you get into mid-career and you've got all these years invested and written all of these articles and all of this sort of stuff, and your whole professional credibility is tied up in something that you say now has been a waste of time, it's not very easy to change. Right. But I think if you keep your mind on what is it that you really want to do, what's your purpose, I think that's the key. You know, if we continue to think about why am I here, I think I tell people all we really need to do is be totally human. We know that the material things of life we can get with economics are important up to a certain level. But beyond that, it's the quality of our relationships with friends and families and within communities that makes life of quality, of importance, that makes life, livable. It's those relationships, and there's science that supports that. But we also need that sense of purpose and meaning to say that what we're doing is right and good. So I think if we stick to that and say, okay, is what we're doing still right and good in our own minds? And then if it's not, then I think we'll find the courage to change.
Well, on that note, we have reached the noon hour and the end of the presentation. I did want to let attendees know that I believe we've recorded this, so it will be available online at some point. We'll send it out to all the attendees. I think we're also going to be sending out a survey, which it'll be brief, but we hope that you'll give us some good feedback, constructive criticism on what we could do better and what we did right. And if you're interested in having HEC do one of these workshops directed for your community specifically, you know, to touch upon maybe what your local zoning ordinances require and might be able to help if there's a particular CAFO issue that's going on there, or for any other reason that you'd like for us to come and speak to a local community group, we'd be happy to do that. So please contact, my email is kferraro@hecweb.org. I think that's in your materials as well. And thank you, Dr. Eichard.
Well, thank you for allowing me to share what I call my truth with people. If their truth is different, that's okay. But I appreciate the opportunity.
We have gotten, if you have a minute, you should see the love that you're getting in chat from all of the people who very much appreciate your comments and your truth.